Hello and welcome to the Night Sky Reader. I'm here with a story to help you relax, meditate, or gently drift to sleep. Tonight, the quiet repair of a weathered book spine. Settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin. In the conservation studio, the evening gathers first at the window. The glass is still pale at the center, but the edges have begun to cool toward blue. Inside, a brass task lamp makes a small warm circle on the bench. In that circle lies a star atlas no larger than two open hands. Its cloth is blue-gray, softened by years of use. The corners are rounded and a little darker than the rest. A trace of graphite dust sits in the weave, especially along the spine, where fingers once rested while pages turned toward one chart after another. This is book restoration in its quiet form. No display case, no dramatic unveiling, only a worn volume, a clean bench, and the careful work of restoring a book spine so the atlas can open again without asking more of its weakened joints than they can safely give. The conservator places the atlas on a foam cradle. The support lifts the boards just enough to keep strain from falling on the broken areas. Around the cradle, the tools are already laid out in the order they may be needed. A soft brush, a microspatula with a thin steel blade, small folders of bone and Teflon, linen thread, a dish for paste, a stack of toned tissue, blotters, press boards. Everything is quiet before it is touched. The atlas does not look neglected. It looks used. That is different. The cloth has a low-handled sheen where thumbs have polished it over time. The head cap is worn through at one corner, and the spine piece has pulled free along most of its length, though it still clings at one edge in a dry, fragile way. The boards are not entirely detached, but they no longer support the text block evenly. When the book is moved, the weight shifts a fraction later than it should. The conservator begins with the kind of looking that is almost stillness. One hand steadies the foredge, the other lifts the front board only as far as the atlas wants to go without protest. The opening is shallow, enough to see the first end paper, the inner hinge, the sewing shape under the paper, enough to feel where resistance starts. The paper has aged into a quiet cream. At the joint, the hinge is tender. It has not yet torn across, but the support has weakened there. The text block itself remains orderly. The gatherings are in place. The sections still hold their sequence. The spine has compressed a little from use, but it has not collapsed. That matters. It means the repair can be guided by what survives, rather than rebuilt into something newer and stiffer than the atlas ever was. Under the lamp, the loose spine cloth shows its own record. Along one edge, the turn-in is frayed. The grain of the cloth is visible where the color has thinned. At the center, a darker line of graphite lies in the weave, like soft dust pressed into fabric by repeated handling. A quicker treatment could strip much of that away. A tidier treatment could flatten every irregularity. But the graphite is not grime. It is record. The atlas is telling the story of its damage in mechanics, not in drama. The atlas is opened once more, slightly farther, then closed. The conservator tests the movement of each board in relation to the text block. The shoulders are noted. The squares at head and tail are checked. Nothing is written on the book itself. The information is carried by eye, by habit, by the quiet memory of proportion built over many evenings like this one. Dust must come away before the joints can be read clearly. The first real movement of the evening is a brush stroke. The brush is soft enough to bend around the grain of the cloth. It moves from the center of a board outward, then along the edges, then lightly over the spine area where the loose piece rests. The sound is small and dry, almost more felt than heard. Dust lifts from the surface in a pale drift and settles onto the bench paper below. The blue-gray cloth looks only slightly brighter after each pass, because the cleaning is not meant to make the book look fresh. It is meant to let the surface speak without the blur of loose grime. At the head cap, the brush reveals threads standing up where the cloth has thinned. Along the tail, it finds a faint line where old pressure shaped the spine, and time has softened it again. The graphite remains in the weave. That is deliberate. What sits loose can be removed. What has settled into the cloth through ordinary use belongs more closely to the atlas than to the dust of the room. The conservator rotates the book a few degrees on the cradle. The brush works along the board edges now, where paper and cloth meet. Those edges are darker from handling. One corner shows tiny impacts in the board beneath the cloth. Another holds a compacted grayness that no dry cleaning will fully reduce, and no full reduction is asked of it. Book restoration depends as much on stopping in time as on starting carefully. A dry cleaning sponge comes next, used only in small areas and with almost no pressure. It touches the board surface in brief, controlled strokes, never scrubbing, never chasing stains deep into the weave. A few lighter patches appear where loose soil has sat on top of the cloth rather than inside it. The effect is modest. On a book like this, modesty is accuracy. The atlas is opened again in the cradle. The first board rises while the text block remains level. Inside, the end paper shows faint darkening near the outer edge, where fingers once found purchase. At the inner hinge, the paper has begun to separate from the board attachment. Not a dramatic split, more a softening, a slight opening where strength has thinned over time. The conservator traces that line without touching it, reading the shape before deciding anything further. Along the top of the text block, the paper edges are smooth in some places and minutely rough in others, depending on how often certain charts were opened. Near the front, one gathering sits a little prouder than the rest, not loose enough to shift, but more active under the fingers. The spine, seen obliquely, has a mild flattening at its center and a little extra give near the head. The brush returns, now smaller, to clear the inside shoulder and the lip where the board lining meets the text block. Fine debris gathers there, fragments of old adhesive, loose fiber, the soft gray of settled dust. As the area clears, the weak places become easier to read. The boards are not failing everywhere. The trouble is specific. The old spine lining has grown brittle. The cloth has detached from that failing layer. One section of sewing near the head has loosened enough to let movement travel too far when the board opens. The room grows darker by 1 degree, then another. Outside the window, the sky has left silver behind and entered blue. Inside the lamp circle, the atlas becomes more distinct. A cleaned surface gives back more information than a dirty one. The conservator slows with it, no longer trying to see a single repair to perform, but a sequence the book itself will tolerate. To know the spine, the cloth must be lifted. The detached spine piece is still original to the binding, and it will be kept. That choice shapes the rest of the work. A full replacement would be simpler. Fresh cloth could be cut, pasted, wrapped, and made neat in a single direction. Preserving the old spine asks for a different rhythm. It means entering the structure in layers and leaving as much of its proportion intact as possible. The conservator slides a thin microspatula beneath an already lifting edge. The blade is nearly flat to the surface. It moves by millimeters, where the old adhesive is dry and powdery. The cloth releases with a faint resistance, like paper separating from paper after years of stillness. Where the adhesive still grips, a trace of moisture is introduced, not directly flooded onto the cloth, but brought in lightly so the old layer can soften just enough to yield. The cloth lifts a little farther. Beneath it, the original spine lining appears in fragments. It is cracked, browned, and stiff. Some areas cling to the cloth, others remain on the spine. Between those fragments, the mull shows through in frayed threads. The old support has done its work for many years. Now it has become a source of strain. The conservator does not rush to strip everything away. The microspatula pauses often. Each surviving layer is tested to see whether it is sound enough to remain, or brittle enough to transfer stress if left in place. Loose pieces are reduced. Stronger pieces are respected. Each touch asks the same quiet question. At the head of the spine, the reason for the extra movement becomes clear. One sewing station has loosened. The thread has not snapped cleanly, but the hold there is weak, and the nearest section lifts a fraction away from its neighbor when pressure is applied. A small structural problem, Small problems are the ones that matter most in a book meant to open and close again. Left alone, that looseness would ask the new spine repair to absorb movement it should never be carrying by itself. The conservator sets down the microspatula, leans back slightly, and looks at the open spine for a moment before continuing. The exposed structure is plain now, dry, fibrous. The logic of the book visible in paper, thread, and cloth. The conservator checks the relation between text block and boards before anything shifts. The head and tail squares are noted again. The shoulder width on each side is read against the case. The atlas is not being redesigned. It is being returned to its own geometry. The lifted spine cloth rests face down on a clean support nearby. Under the lamp, its underside shows old adhesive in pale ridges and islands. The outer face is worn, blue-gray, and dignified. Now the book is speaking more plainly. The conservator works more gently after this point, as if neatness has stepped back and proportion has taken its place. The next stage begins a few inches from the atlas, at the part of the bench where materials are made ready. A small stack of Japanese tissue waits in graded weights, from nearly translucent to thin but stronger sheets with long visible fibers. The conservator selects a tissue light enough to move with the spine. Grain direction is tested between the fingers. One strip is torn rather than cut, so the edge will feather into the old surface instead of creating a hard line. A narrower support is prepared from linen, strong and flexible, sized for the scale of the atlas rather than a larger volume. Nearby, a toned sheet is compared against the lifted spine cloth. It does not have to match perfectly. It only has to sit quietly if a sliver of it becomes visible at the joint. The color leans toward the muted blue-gray of evening cloud, softened with a little neutral earth so it will not look sharp beside the worn original. The conservator trims the tone by eye, holding the paper under the lamp, then slightly off to one side because color changes under warm light. The final choice is restrained. Wheat starch paste is brought forward in a shallow dish. It has already been cooked and cooled, then worked smooth until no lumps remain. A brush stirs it once. The surface folds and settles. Its scent is faint and clean, like warm grain reduced to almost nothing. On the bench, it gives a brief shine wherever it lands, then dries matte, becoming less visible as it becomes useful. Before any new lining goes on, the exposed spine is reduced only as much as needed. Dry flakes of failing adhesive are lifted away with the microspatula. Fibers that still lie flat and hold are left alone. The goal is a surface sound enough to receive support, not a stripped surface pretending to youth. The weak sewing near the head is addressed next. The atlas is supported so the gatherings are not spread wider than necessary. A fine linen thread is chosen, thin enough not to crowd the original holes. The conservator follows the existing sewing stations rather than inventing a new path. A curved needle passes in and out with careful economy. No dramatic tugging, no bright new pattern crossing the folds. Only a few passes, enough to secure the loosened section back into the regular hold of the text block. When the thread is drawn snug, the movement at the head lessens. The section settles. The new thread is trimmed close. The conservator tests the flex with fingertips at the spine fold. The response is small, springing back into place without strain. The first tissue lining is now prepared. Paste is brushed onto the strip in a thin, even layer. Too much moisture would swell the old paper. Too little would leave weak adhesion. The right amount leaves the tissue supple and barely shining. It is carried to the spine on a support sheet, then lowered with control along the length of the text block. A folder through a barrier eases it into contact, pressing just enough to seat the fibers into the old surface. The tissue does two things at once. It gathers the spine into a more stable skin, and it distributes future movement over a wider area than the brittle original lining could manage. After it is placed, the conservator watches for any sign of buckling, any lifted edge, any excess paste. A blotter touches the margins lightly. The shine dulls. The tissue becomes almost one color with the spine beneath it. The narrow linen support is tested dry before it is pasted. Its width is important. Too wide and it would crowd the joints. too narrow and it would ask too much of the paper lining alone. It must strengthen the back without making the atlas resistant to opening. Flex is checked in the air, then against the curve of the text block. It bends willingly. That is enough. The room has grown very still. The sounds are separated and easy to hear. Brush and paste, brush on tissue. The soft click of a dish set down, paper lifted, board moved. Even the bench seems to absorb sound and return it reduced. In this quiet, preparation does not feel like waiting. It feels like the heart of the work. By the time the materials are ready, most of the repair has already been decided in scale, thickness, and restraint. Then the evening reaches its most exact point. The spine can be rebuilt. Fresh paste is brushed onto the linen support in a layer so thin that the weave is still legible. The brush strokes run the length of the strip, then cross once to even them. The conservator lifts the support and brings it over the atlas. The exposed spine waits in the center, newly lined, stable but still vulnerable. The linen is lowered onto it from the middle outward, following the existing curve rather than correcting it into anything sharper. Through a protective sheet, the support is pressed down along the spine. The contact is firm and brief. At either edge, enough material remains to reconnect structure where the joints have failed. The atlas is turned slightly in the cradle, so the first board can be brought back into alignment. The shoulder is read by touch. The square at the foredge is checked. The board comes in close, not clamped tight, only invited back into its original relation with the text block. There is a quiet concentration here that has nothing to do with hurry, though paste is beginning its slow set. The conservator adjusts by fractions. A board can sit true or slightly skewed, and the difference only appears later, when the book opens. The eye moves from head to tail, from shoulder to square, then back again. The second board follows. The spine support now bridges what the old broken lining could no longer manage. A second, very thin tissue layer is added where needed to soften the transition and support the original cloth. The materials are not stacked for mass. They are feathered for cooperation. Surfaces that have forgotten how to hand-force to one another are given the chance to remember. The lifted spine cloth is brought back next. Before it returns, the underside is reduced carefully where brittle adhesive ridges would create lumps. The cloth is then aligned over the repaired spine, its worn blue-gray face once again becoming the visible back of the atlas. Under the lamp, the graphite dust still sits in the weave. The frayed edge at the head is still frayed. Paste, lighter now, is brushed where the cloth needs to bond. The spine piece settles into place over the new support. A folder through a thin barrier smooths it from center outward. Along the joints, the edges are coaxed down rather than stretched. Old cloth has limits. Pulled too far, it announces the pull forever. Allowed to lie where it wants to lie, it often finds its old shape again with surprising dignity. The conservator checks the spine profile. It is not perfectly symmetrical. It was not perfectly symmetrical before. One side carries a little more wear, and therefore a little more flattening than the other. To force exact symmetry now would be to replace history with design. The small irregularity remains. At the head, the repaired sewing and the new spine support now work together. The earlier slack is gone. At the tail, the cloth edge settles without springing up. The boards meet the text block more squarely. When tested with the gentlest opening, the book moves in a single coordinated way again, not as case and text block arguing with each other, but as joined parts. The structure is reconnected, but the adhesive is still green. Surfaces that look settled can still drift if pressure is misjudged. The next actions are smaller, not larger. Protective sheets are placed where they will prevent any stray moisture from offsetting onto adjacent surfaces. A smooth barrier goes over the repaired spine. The conservator defines the joints lightly through that barrier, pressing with a folder only enough to clarify the hinge line and help the cloth remember its path. No direct rubbing touches the outer surface. No aggressive shaping is used. The spine is encouraged, not forced. The atlas is lifted with both hands and transferred to a waiting setup of boards and supports. Waste sheets cushion the areas that need separation. The spine rests in a shallow channel, so its rounded memory is not crushed flat. Press boards come down above and below, not heavy, only even. A modest weight is added, enough to hold alignment while the paste dries, not enough to erase the contour that allows the book to open with ease. The conservator steps back, then returns for one adjustment. The front board shifts by the width of a fingernail and is corrected. A corner of the barrier sheet is pulled smooth. The weight is reset. After that, the hands withdraw. The atlas will not be opened again tonight. That is part of the repair. The new work needs stillness now more than inspection. The strength has been introduced. The rest belongs to drying, settling, and the slow agreement materials make with one another when left undisturbed. On the bench, the tools are no longer in strict expectation. The paste brush is rinsed and laid to dry. The microspatula is wiped clean. Scraps of toned tissue remain at one side like soft, irregular petals of paper, useful perhaps for another repair, or perhaps only as the record of calibration already completed. The dish of paste has lost its shine at the edges where a thin film begins to dry matte. The lamp still warms the bench in a tight circle, but the rest of the studio has receded. Shelves of cloth and board, rolls of blotter, stacked press materials, all settle into gentler dimness. At the sink, a bead of water clings to steel and does not fall. Near the window, the air is cooler than it was at dusk. Outside, the sky has deepened into full evening. The glass reflects part of the lamp, so the room and the night briefly share the same surface. Beyond that reflection, a few stars are visible, not many, only the first clear points above the darker line of neighboring roofs. The atlas rests under its light pressure beneath the lamp, while the actual sky gathers beyond the pane. The echo is present, but quiet. Cloth, paper, and thread remain the center of things. There is relief in a bench at this stage, not triumph, not display. Only the clean fact that nothing more should be done right now. The temptation to keep perfecting has passed. The frayed edge remains frayed. The handled sheen remains. The graphite dust that belongs to the weave remains. What has changed is structural. The book can now begin the night in better balance than it had when the evening started. If the spine were uncovered at this moment, the new work would be only partly visible. A line more settled at the joint, a cloth surface lying closer to its support, a board sitting true against the text block. Most of the repair has already become discreet. A thin line of wheat starch paste gleams briefly, then dries matte. Support is added so that motion feels natural again. Attention leaves its mark for a moment, then gives the object back to itself. The studio grows quieter the longer the atlas rests. Even the smallest sounds have been accounted for and put away. No pages turn, no brush moves. The weight on the press boards does its patient work without sound. Under the barrier sheets, the spine holds its shape. Within the text block, the resewn station near the head sits steady among its neighbors. Soon the lamp will be switched off. The boards will remain. The paste will continue to lose moisture through the dark hours. Linen, tissue, old cloth, and paper will settle into one another with the ordinary intimacy of things joined carefully and then left alone. By morning, the spine will have less shine, less give, more memory of its proper line. For now, the room offers only this final arrangement: a small star atlas under light pressure, clean tools at rest, the faint scent of paste and paper, the cool window holding a few distant points of light, and around all of it, the calm architecture of a workspace built for careful hands, careful stopping, and the kind of repair that continues even in stillness. Thank you for spending this time with the Night Sky Reader. May your night be peaceful. Until next time, rest well.